I'm gonna go over the materials that you guys are going to need for your reduction projects. I'm gonna start here with the screen filler. You guys are gonna be using the Speedball Screen Printing Screen Filler. It's a red liquidy substance. It's red and it's liquidy. This stuff dries, and when it dries like glue. So you don't want to get it like in your clothes, and you want to make sure that you're keeping it free from like your table and stuff like that. But this is what we're going to be using to block out our screens and to create our stencils in our screens. I've got some paintbrushes here of various sizes, since I have a bunch of different details and spaces that I'm going to be painting out in my design. I've got like a foam brush, some of these, what would you call these, like flat brushes, some tiny round brushes. So you want to make sure that you've got some paintbrushes of, you know, like I said, different sizes. I'm using just like your standard like acrylic oil paintbrush. You could use watercolor, but the bristles are kind of soft. So you want to use just like your old standard, or you could use like a craft paintbrush or something to paint out your stencil in your screen. I've got my final drawing here, so I'm going to be doing this little bird, and I've mapped out the colors on my drawing, so that way when I'm painting out my screen, I kind of have an idea of, you know, what areas I want to keep what color when I'm painting it out. So I highly suggest that when you guys do this, you create your final drawing or your final design or whatever, and then you map out the colors that you want certain areas to be, so that way it kind of creates less confusion when you're going through this process. I think for this project I'm going to be using about 8 different colors, so I'm going to use like white up here for the top of its little head here and like the highlights, and then I'm going to be using some pale yellow for its little crest right there, light gray for the beak. I'm going to do some brown here, like burnt sienna, some burnt orange, and then dark browns for its body, and then some black / dark blue for the other parts of his head here and his eyeball. So yeah, so it helps that if you guys like map this out and sort of have like an idea of where you're going with this before you start this process, that way it might not feel so overwhelming. So I highly suggest creating a sketch or a drawing and then coloring in those spaces that you want to be certain colors. This is important. I have a piece of acetate here. It's just a clear sheet, a clear protective covering that I'm going to put over top of my drawing. And then I have just some old blue tape here that I'm going to be using to tape down my drawing and my acetate. Over here I have my screen. My screen is completely clean, so you want to make sure that when you guys are starting this, that you're starting with a completely clean screen. That way when you pull to print, you're not going to get any weird stuff happening in your prints from like anything that could have been in your screen. So I've got my screen here. I've got it secure in my little hinges up here. I find that it's easier to do this process if your screen's not like moving around everywhere. So it might be helpful for you guys to keep it secure in your screen printing hinges while you're doing this. You can also do this process though without securing your screen, so you don't have to have it tightened down if you don't have your hinges or something yet. But it does help to keep it like steady while you're painting out your screens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift up my screen here. I'm going to take my drawing and I'm going to place it about, I don't know. I'm going to place it about like in the center-ish of my screen. It doesn't really matter too much of the exact placement of where it's going to go. I'm just making sure that I'm not placing it too close to any edge. If you paint out your image too close to an edge, when you go to print, it's not going to print properly because you can't get good pressure at any of the edges here. So you want to make sure that when you're like painting out your screen, or in the future when you're doing photo emulsion images or whatever, that you have your stencil painted out or exposed like in the middle-ish. So this is probably like the Goldilocks zone of your screen. That way when you go to print it, you can actually like print a proper image. And what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna take some blue tape, or you can take Scotch tape, whatever, painter's tape, masking tape, doesn't matter. I'm gonna take some tape and I'm going to tape down my drawing so that way it's not moving around when I start painting out my screen. And then I'm going to take a sheet of acetate, preferably clean acetate, and I'm also going to tape that down. And what the acetate does, it's going to protect our drawing while we're painting out our screen. When you guys start painting out your screen, you might find that the screen fillers will leak through your screen and onto your table or your surface or your drawing. And since we're going to need our drawing throughout the duration of this entire project, we don't want to damage our drawing with the screen filler. So you're going to want to protect it with a piece of acetate or some sort of clear covering, just in case there's any like spills that happen through your screen, which more than likely there will be. So yeah, so make sure that you guys definitely put a piece of acetate down. I've found that a lot of students doing this project forget to do this step, and then they end up really ruining their drawings or their designs throughout the duration of this process. And you know, it kind of sucks. So yeah, so it's just a simple step, an easy thing to do. Just make sure that you're protecting your drawing at all times when you're doing this. So now that I have my acetate taped down to my table, I've got my drawing taped down, my screen is secure, I'm going to lower my screen, and I'm going to just take a paintbrush here and I'm going to prop it up. It's also important, this is a very important thing to remember. If you remember anything from this video, remember this. You don't want your screen touching the table when you're doing this. You want to make sure that it's propped up even just like the slightest bit, because if your screen is touching the table while you're trying to paint it out, the screen filler will leak through onto your table, get stuck to the table. It's going to mess up your whole entire thing. So please make sure that you prop it up with either like a little thing like a paintbrush or a pencil, or you can use a roll of tape, anything honestly, to make sure that the mesh of your screen is not touching your table. Then you're probably like, well, how am I supposed to paint this out and get perfect registration if my screen isn't directly touching the table? You can definitely like lean over your screen and paint out while you're going, and press, sometimes I like press down just a little bit to see if it's lining up with my drawing. But don't worry, rest assured, you will still be able to paint it out and get the registration pretty on point. But yeah, you don't want it to touch your table. You can see my setup overhead here. I've got my bird in the center of my screen. I've got it secured down to my table. And what I'm going to start doing now is I'm going to start painting out my screen with the screen filler. I'm going to start off by blocking out my white layer. When you're doing the reduction process, you want to make sure that you're going from lightest to darkest. Since the screen filler has a negative line mark making effect, anything that you're going to paint out is not going to print. So I'm going to start off with my lightest layer, which is going to be my white layer, and I'm going to go ahead and paint out all the areas that I want to keep white on my bird here. So I'm going to paint out his little white tufts up here in his head, the little highlights on his eyes, and some highlights maybe like on the beak and stuff. And then I also don't want any colors in the background here. So I'm gonna go ahead and paint out this area here so that way it doesn't print. Got the camera here zoomed in on my bird here. So I've got the first layer painted out. I didn't use a whole bunch of screen filler. If you saw in the previous footage, I was painting both the front and the back of the screen because it did get like a little bit globby in some areas. You definitely do not need a whole bunch of screen filler. Less is more. You just need enough to cover like a thin layer of your area that you're trying to cover. Trust me, like the globbier this stuff gets, the harder it is to, number one, get out of your screen, and then number two, it could get actually like in your paper and in your prints when you go to print. So you definitely don't need a bunch of screen filler to get the job done. You just need to make sure that when you hold your screen up to the light that there's no light shining through, and then that should be a good enough layer to prevent ink from going through your screen. So I have the areas here painted out that I want to be the color of my paper. I totally forgot that the paper I'm using for this project is actually cream and not white. I'm usually used to using white paper, so I just usually paint out the areas that I want to keep white, meaning the color of the paper. But this is a little bit different this time. I'm actually going to be printing white onto my paper. So I painted out the areas that I'm going to keep the color of my paper. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my screen, I'm going to stick it in front of a fan to dry for about 10 to 15 minutes. If you don't have a fan, you can let it air dry for about, I don't know, like 15 minutes to a half an hour. You just want to make sure that your screen filler is dry to touch and doesn't come off on your hands or whatever when you touch it before you go on to printing it. So I'm going to go ahead and let this dry, and then I'm going to print my first color. While you're waiting for your screen to dry, you can go ahead and get your materials ready for printing. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about the materials I have over here that I'm going to use for printing and that you will probably need for printing as well. Right here, I've got my inks from For information, or if you need a tutorial on mixing inks and what different modifiers, what they do for what thing, you can go ahead and refer to the ink mixing video. But I've got my first 3 colors mixed up here, and then I'll mix my other darker colors as I go along. So I've got a gray color, a white, which is what I'm going to print first, and then a pale yellow. I have a squeegee. I'm using a squeegee that has a sharper blade, so I'm using a green squeegee here. And I've picked one that is a little bit larger than the size of my image. When you're picking a squeegee for printing, you want to make sure that you get one that's a little bit larger than the size of your image, but not too large. And you don't want one that's too small, otherwise you're going to get inconsistent printing if you pick a squeegee that's too small or too large. So I've picked one that is, like I said, a little bit larger than the size of my image to ensure that it's going to print properly. I've got a prop here for propping my screen up. You can use anything, honestly. You can use like a roll of tape or something, I don't know. I've got a wood block here, so that's what I'm using to prop up my screen. I've got some tapes. I've got some packing tape that I use to block out my screen, the excess areas I don't want to print, and I'll show you guys that in a second. I got some blue tape for taping down my transparency, and then for also with some registration if needed. I got a spatula for mixing ink, for applying ink to my screen and what have you. I have my paper. I already have it all hole punched and ready to go. If you're confused as to what this is or why I hole punched my paper, you can go ahead and check out the registration and or paper tearing video if you need a refresher on that. And I have my registration set up right here with my pins, and they're taped down to my little registration jig. So again, if you're confused on what this is or how to set this up, please refer to the registration video, and that will go into more depth onto why we're using this and what this is for. Over here, I have my screen. The screen filler is completely dry, so when I touch it, nothing comes off on my hands. And then for the areas around the screen filler here, I taped off with packing tape. I taped my screen on the outer side of my screen, not the inner side, because taping it on the inner side could mess up your printing or whatever when you run the squeegee over it. So you want to make sure that you apply the tape to the outer side of your screen. So I'm using packing tape because I know that it's going to stay on longer, but it's not as I don't know, as tacky or will stick as like rough as like duct tape will. Sometimes the adhesives in tape can stick to your screen after you take the tape off, and it can be kind of a hassle to clean it out. So I'm just using some regular old packing tape here. I've taped off the areas around my screen filler part. The reason why I did this instead of just painting out my screen with screen filler is because screen filler is also kind of a pain to get out of your screen, and especially since you guys doing this at home most likely won't have access to a power washer, it's going to be even more of a pain to get out of your screen. So instead of painting all these areas in with screen filler, we can just use like packing tape or whatever to block off these areas. That way they don't get onto our printing surface or our paper. It is important though that you do make sure that you block off the open areas of your screen that could potentially get ink onto your printing surface or paper, because this is going to save you a bunch of headache when you go ahead and start printing. We really just want the ink to go through one part of our screen and nowhere else. So yeah, if you have like these areas open while you try to print, you're gonna get ink like everywhere, all over your paper, all over your table, all over yourself. I've seen it before. Just please, if you do anything again, listen to me. Just tape off these areas or block them out somehow. That way you just don't get ink all over everything while you're doing this. So as you can see here, I taped off the bottom part to the metal frame here taped off the top part to the metal frame, and then I taped off about like, I don't know, like 5 or 6 inches away from my screen filler area. My squeegee here, like I said before, is a little bit larger than my image that I'm printing. So I don't really foresee the ink going further than like over here or over there. You know, I'm not printing like a large area. If I were to print a larger area, I would probably tape off all the way to the edges of my screen, on these edges over here. But since I'm not, I think that just taping it like a few inches away from my screen filler area should be fine. Underneath my screen, I have my acetate. This is what I'm going to use to help with my registration. We're going to start off by using acetate, and we're going to print on here first so we can determine where our image is going to print on our paper, and that'll make more sense once I start printing. But I've got my acetate here, and if you see over here, it's taped down with some blue tape. So I use some blue tape. You can use packing tape, you can use duct tape, you can use whatever tape you want. But you want to make sure that you have just like a secure hinge taped down, so that way you can move your acetate and flip it back and forth while you're printing, and you'll know that it's not going to like move anywhere while you're doing that. So I've got a few pieces of blue tape here, like really taped down, to make sure that while I'm flipping my acetate back and forth, it's not going to like shift or move. If the acetate does shift or move while you're printing, that's going to mess up your registration a little bit, because like I said before, we're going to first start off by printing onto the acetate to determine where our prints are going to land on our paper. So if this thing moves while we're printing, then that's going to sort of mess up all of the registration that we were working so hard to achieve. So you want to make sure that this is really taped down really well. We're creating a hinge, like I said before, because we want to be able to flip it back and forth. So what we're going to do first, like I said, we're going to print onto this, and then we're going to flip it, place our paper underneath, flip it back, line our paper up, and then flip it back once more to print onto our paper. So yeah, it's like super important that you make sure you got a nice secure hinge taped down, and that you only tape one side down. You know what I'm saying? Like, so you don't have to tape down all 4 edges of your piece of acetate. You don't have to tape down 2 edges. You just pick an edge, just one edge, and then tape it down. I usually tape down either like, I think this is the right edge, the left edge, or the bottom. You don't want to tape down the top, because this is where our screen is going to go, and we're not going to be able to flip it back because our screen is going to be blocking that area. So you want to pick an open area, so you really got like 3 edges you can tape down. So pick an open area and pick an edge and tape it down. My acetate is larger, much larger than my image. This is also important. You want to get like a pretty decent sized sheet of acetate for this, because if you have like a smaller piece of acetate and you're trying to register, the pressure from your screen could press down and create a crease in the acetate when you're flipping it back and like pulling your print. So you want to make sure that you've got a piece that's large enough to be out of the way while you're printing, to be out of the, I guess, what is it, like the perimeter of your screen while you're printing, just to make sure that, you know, you don't get any creases and any mishaps in your registration. Again, if you get a crease in this, or you know, something weird happens, and if anything weird happens to this, it's gonna mess up your registration. So you want to make sure that it stays like in its original position like this, without any creases, throughout the duration of the printing process. First things first, I'm going to take my screen and I'm going to lay the flat side down onto the table here, and I'm going to secure my screen to the hinges on my printing board. So you make sure that your screen is tightly secure in there. As so. So that way, when you wiggle it, it's not going to wiggle around everywhere. Under here, you can see that I still have my acetate set up. And it's already taped down, ready to go. I'm going to prop up my screen with my little wood block here. So that way my screen is not touching my table. I'm gonna take some of my ink. I'm taking my white ink because this is my first color. So I'm gonna take some white ink here. And I'm going to take my spatula and apply a generous amount to the bottom of my image. What we're going to do first, before we pull a print, is we're going to do something that's called flooding your screen. And what flooding does is that it floods your image with ink and allows like all of that ink to get into all of the areas of your image. And that way when you go to pull it, you pull a nice clean print. If you were to skip this step and not flood your screen before printing, there will be like some weird patchy areas that don't show up well. You know, it won't print as properly or as cleanly as you probably want it to be. So we're gonna first start off by flooding our screen. So I put a decent amount of ink at the bottom of my image. I'm gonna take my squeegee here. My screen is still propped up, so it's not touching my table. You don't want it touching your table when you're doing this. And I'm gonna hold my squeegee at a 45-degree angle, and I'm gonna push that ink away from me. So I pushed it away from me, all the way covering the whole entire area, the open area of my stencil. All the excess ink on my squeegee I just smacked off at the top here. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm going to take away my block, toss it over there, and I'm going to hold my squeegee again at a 45-degree angle, pressing down towards me with both hands, and I'm going to press down firmly and pull towards me. And I'm going to smack off the excess ink. I have my screen lifted here. I'm going to keep my screen lifted and I'm going to flood my image again. It's important that in between each print that you do, in between whatever it is that you're doing, well, I don't know what it is you'd be doing, but in between each print, make sure that you always flood your screen. So don't pull a print and then just like hang out and not flood your screen. Before you even put your print in the drying rack or wherever it is you're letting it dry or whatever, like I said, whatever it is that you do, make sure that you flood your screen because if you don't, then all that ink will dry up in your screen and it'll just cause sadness. So when you go to pull your prints again, you'll get those patchy areas that you probably don't want and inconsistencies in your printing. So always flood your screen. Screen printing ink, since it is water-based, dries relatively quickly, so you want to be sort of fast with this. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to load up my paper onto my little registration jig here, and as you can see here, I have my little bird printed onto my surface here, my acetate. And I'm going to line up my paper to where I want this to print. So I've got my paper underneath my acetate and I'm using my acetate as a guide for where I'm going to print my little birds on my paper. And for the first color, it doesn't really matter. You just pick a spot that you think looks good. For the other colors, it's going to matter for your registration. But for this, I'm thinking that this looks good enough for me. And then, or does it? I don't know. Okay. And then I'm going to take some blue tape and I'm going to tape down my registration jig so that way it doesn't move while I'm printing. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull a print on my paper. So I'm going to take away my acetate, let that hang off the table. My paper is exposed. I'm going to rest my screen down. There we go. On my paper here. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to pull down at a 45-degree angle and press down, pull towards me. Smack off the excess ink. Flood my screen again. And ta-da! So I've got some of the screen filler probably isn't dry enough. Some of it came off onto my paper here, but yes, so I've got my bird printed right here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and finish printing the rest of my edition, and then once I'm done, I'm gonna rinse out my screen and go ahead and start painting out my second color. I'm completely done pulling the amount of prints that I want to for this edition. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to scrape up as much ink as I can off of my screen, and I'm going to put it back into my little ink cup here. To scrape up my screen, I'm using one of these like little pink body putty squeegees because I think they work really well for scraping up all the excess ink. But you can also use your spatula that you have for like applying ink onto your screen or whatever. So I'm just gonna go ahead, scrape up all the extra, and put it back into my container. This helps save a bunch of ink, and also, especially since you guys are doing this at home, you probably don't want to clog your sinks with all of this ink. So it definitely helps to scoop up as much of it as you possibly can. Same thing with my squeegee. I'm just going to scrape this off into my little cup here. Okay, and then I'm going to take these guys over to the washout booth, and I'm going to just rinse them out with water. If you're doing this at home, you can take this to either your bathtub, or if you have a hose outside, you can take it outside and spray it down. It's important that you only wash it out with water. You shouldn't need to use any other chemicals or anything to rinse out the ink in your screen. And don't power wash. If you have a power washer, please do not power wash. We're just gonna go rinse it out. So I'm gonna take this guy off of here. Also, you want to make sure that you want to clean out your screen, rinse it out right after you're done printing. You don't want the ink at all to dry into your screen, because if it does, it's going to be that much harder to get out and could compromise the way that your future layers look on your project. So you want to make sure that you guys rinse out your screens ASAP after you're done printing. So for my registration jig, I'm just going to untape it and put it to the side. We'll use it later for when we go ahead and print our second color. So I'll put this guy over there. And then for my acetate, again, you're going to want to reuse this as well. So I'm just taking some simple green here. I'm going to spray it down with some simple green, and I'm going to wipe off my image for my acetate. You wanna, yeah, so you wanna wipe off the images from your acetate that you printed on there so you can reuse your acetate for your different colors. You can use simple green to clean it, you can use Crud Cutter, you can use soap and water, or you could use probably just water. The ink comes off really easily. So yeah, so then you wanna make sure that you clean your acetate, and now I'm gonna go and clean my squeegees and my screen.